Story 1. It was New Year's Eve, and I was excited about the party I was going to at my colleague Rachel's place. I had known Rachel for a while at the office, and though we weren't best friends, we were close enough to be invited to her annual New Year's bash. Her apartment wasn't too far from mine, and from what I'd heard, it was always a fun time. I arrived at around 8 p.m. There were about 10 people from work already there, some faces I recognized, others I didn't. The party was lively, with laughter and chatter filling the air. I didn't know anyone else too well, but Rachel was a great host, and the food and drinks made it all the more enjoyable. The apartment was cozy, with the living room leading into a small kitchen area. There was also a guest room off to the side. The atmosphere was warm and comfortable, perfect for a New Year's celebration. Around 9 p.m., a knock echoed through the apartment. At first, nobody seemed to notice, as the music was loud, and people were busy chatting. But when I turned to the door, I saw a woman standing there. She looked to be in her late 20s, dressed in a long black coat. She wasn't someone I recognized, and when she smiled, it felt off, too perfect, too deliberate. She introduced herself as Evelyn and claimed to be a friend of Rachel's. "Come on in," I said, stepping aside to let her in, assuming Rachel had invited her. She didn't say much after that. She just nodded, past me, and headed straight for the kitchen without even a glance around. I thought it was a bit strange that she didn't seem to interact with anyone else, but I shrugged it off, focusing on the conversation in the living room. Hours passed, and I lost track of time, playing a few rounds of Cards Against Humanity with some coworkers. As midnight approached, everyone gathered in the living room for the countdown. It was 12 o'clock, the cheers and cheers went up, and the new year had officially begun. As the party began to wind down, people started leaving. It was around 1 a.m. when I realized that I hadn't seen Evelyn again. I hadn't really thought about her until now, but I figured she had just left after the countdown. Still, it was a little odd that no one had mentioned her during the goodbyes. Rachel, the host, was still there cleaning up, and I offered to help. The two of us worked together in silence for a few minutes, and then we heard something, a loud scraping noise coming from the back of the apartment, near the guest room. At first, it sounded like something heavy had fallen, but the noise kept coming. "Do you hear that?" I whispered to Rachel, my heart racing. Rachel looked at me with a blank expression. "Yeah. Sounds like someone's in the guest room." "Are you sure? The door's locked, right?" I asked, suddenly feeling uneasy. Rachel didn't answer immediately. She got up and slowly walked towards the door. Just as she reached for the handle, we heard it again, this time, a soft, dragging sound, followed by a faint humming noise. It was eerie, like someone was moving furniture, but I couldn't make out the details. "Rachel, don't open the door," I hissed, feeling a chill run down my spine. But it was too late. She swung the door open and froze. There, standing in the middle of the room, was Evelyn. She was staring at the floor, her back to us, her long black coat hanging like a shadow in the dim light of the room. She didn't turn when we entered. "Evelyn?" Rachel called, but there was no response. I took a step forward. "Evelyn, are you okay?" Still nothing. Suddenly, Evelyn slowly turned her head. Her face was pale, too pale, with wide eyes that glowed unnaturally. A soft smile spread across her lips, but it wasn't a friendly one. It was cold, like something was terribly wrong. "You shouldn't have let me in," she whispered, her voice almost drowned by the hum that still filled the room. My pulse quickened. "What do you mean? You're not supposed to be here." She tilted her head, her smile widening as her eyes flickered to Rachel. "You didn't invite me, did you?" Rachel was staring at her, frozen in place. I don't know who you are," Rachel stammered. Evelyn didn't reply. Instead, she turned toward the window, which was cracked open. Her hand reached out, and the window slid open even further, as if pulled by some invisible force. "We have to get out of here," I whispered, grabbing Rachel's arm. But when I looked back, Evelyn was gone. The room was empty, and there was no trace of her anywhere. We stood there in stunned silence. The room felt colder, and the humming noise had stopped. "What just happened?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said. "But I'm getting out of here." We both hurried to the door, but before we could leave, we heard it again. A soft knocking on the front door. I froze. "No. Don't open it." We backed away slowly, trying not to make a sound. But the knocking continued, louder and louder, until it stopped suddenly. It was the silence that was worse than the noise. "Should we call the police?" Rachel asked, her voice barely a whisper. Before I could answer, the doorbell rang. Slowly, I walked over to the peephole and looked out. My breath caught in my throat. There, standing on the other side, was Evelyn, staring straight at me, her lips moving, but no sound came through the door. Then, the door handle began to twist. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt heavy, suffocating. I looked over at Rachel, but when I turned back to the door, Evelyn was gone. Not a sound, not a movement. We never figured out what happened that night. Rachel moved out of the apartment soon after, and I never saw her again. As for me, I can't shake the feeling that Evelyn is still out there, waiting. And every New Year's Eve since then, I hear that same knock at my door. Story 2. It was the winter of 2005, and I was 13 years old. New Year's Eve had always been a time for my family to stay up late together. This year, we were at home, snug in our quiet suburban neighborhood. It had been snowing all day, leaving a thick blanket of white across the front yard. That year, I made a promise to myself, would stay awake until midnight. Usually, I'd be in bed long before the ball dropped, but this year felt different. I wanted to be part of the excitement, even if it meant staying up all night. Around 11:30 p.m., my parents and younger brother were already fast asleep. I was in the living room, watching TV, the only one left awake. The house was eerily silent, with only the occasional hum of the heater to break the stillness. I got up to get a snack from the kitchen and saw that the window was slightly open. It was freezing outside, but the cool breeze felt good, so I didn't mind. I cracked it open a little wider to let in more fresh air, then returned to the couch. Just then, I heard a sound from outside. It was faint at first, just a soft rustle in the snow, but it quickly grew louder, like someone was walking in the yard. I hesitated, then went to the window. Looking out into the darkness, I couldn't see much except the outline of trees and the faint glow of streetlights on the snow. But I could hear footsteps. Someone was walking through the yard. I squinted, trying to make out who it could be. Our street was always quiet at night, especially on New Year's Eve when everyone was either inside or at parties. The footsteps grew louder, and then, just as I was about to turn away from the window, I saw him. A man, cloaked in black, was walking toward the back of our house, his heavy boots leaving deep imprints in the snow. He was tall, and his face was hidden in shadow. I couldn't make out any details, but his movements were deliberate and slow. I stepped back from the window, my heart pounding. Who was he? Why was he out there in the middle of the night? I felt a surge of panic rush through me, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just someone walking by, lost in the snow. I decided to go downstairs and check it out. The lights in the house were off, and the dark hallways felt colder as I moved quietly through the house. I reached the back door and cautiously looked out the small window beside it. The man was still there, standing motionless near the edge of the yard. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there. The longer I watched him, the more uneasy I felt. There was something off about him, like he wasn't supposed to be there. Suddenly, he turned toward the house. My breath caught in my throat. For a split second, I could have sworn that he was staring directly at me. His eyes seemed to glow in the darkness, but I couldn't see his face clearly. It was as if the night had swallowed him whole. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. Should I wake my parents? I didn't want to alarm them, but the man was still there. I hesitated, wondering if I should just ignore it and go back upstairs. But then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A knock on the door. It was soft at first, but it grew louder, more urgent. 3 sharp raps. I froze, staring at the door, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it would burst. Who could be knocking at this hour? I glanced out the back window again, but the man was gone. I tried to convince myself it was just some strange coincidence, maybe he was lost and had turned around. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The knock came again. This time, I was paralyzed. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I just stood there, staring at the door. Then the doorbell rang. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I finally gathered the courage to open the door, there was no one there. Not a single trace of the man, no footprints in the snow, nothing. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin, but there was nothing. The yard was empty. No signs of anyone having been there, not even a footprint in the snow. I looked all around, trying to make sense of it, but nothing made sense. I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. I went to the front window and peered out, but still, there was no one. The snow had begun to fall again, covering everything in a thick layer. The strangest part? The next morning, when my parents and I went out to shovel the driveway, there were no tracks leading to or from our house. It was as if the man had never been there. But I know what I saw. To this day, I can't explain it. Who was the man? Why did he knock on the door? And where did he go? Every year, on New Year's Eve, I feel that same sense of unease, wondering if the man will return. Story 3. It was New Year's Eve, and I was hosting a small gathering at my apartment. Just a few close friends, Emily, Tom, and Claire. Nothing too extravagant. We weren't the type to go out and party, so it felt perfect to stay in, have some snacks, and watch movies as the clock ticked closer to midnight. I lived in a small, quiet building in a city that never seemed to sleep, but on that night, the streets outside felt eerily silent. It was as though the entire world was holding its breath in anticipation of the new year. Around 11:30 p.m., we were sitting in the living room, chatting and laughing. The TV was on in the background, the volume low as the countdown to midnight began. The small space was cozy, with soft lighting and a relaxed atmosphere. I felt safe, surrounded by good friends and the warmth of the apartment. Then, just as we were all laughing at something stupid on TV, there was a knock at the door. It was unexpected. The 4 of us had been the only ones there, and we hadn't invited anyone else. I glanced at the door, feeling a brief flutter of confusion. "Who's that?" Tom asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. I got up from the couch, glancing back at my friends. "Probably a neighbor or something," I said, but my voice sounded unsure even to my own ears. I wasn't expecting anyone. I approached the door cautiously, feeling an odd twinge of unease. When I reached it, I peered through the peephole but saw nothing, no one was there. "That's strange," I muttered under my breath. "Maybe they left." I opened the door, half expecting to find nothing at all, but to my surprise, no one had gone. A tall man stood there, dressed in a long, dark coat. His face was hidden in shadow, and he stood completely still, staring down at the floor. I froze. Can I help you?" I asked, my voice tight. I wasn't sure why, but something about him seemed wrong. He lifted his head slowly and looked directly at me. His eyes were unsettling, pale, almost lifeless. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he just stood there, staring at me in silence. "Hello?" I asked again, stepping back slightly. I could feel a cold chill running down my spine. The man took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice soft and strangely calm. There was something about the way he spoke that made my skin crawl. I blinked, unsure of what to say. "I think you have the wrong apartment," I said, my heart starting to race. "We weren't expecting anyone." The man didn't respond. He just stood there, unmoving, his eyes never leaving mine. It was as if he were waiting for me to invite him in. I could feel the weight of the silence growing between us, thick and oppressive. "Listen," I began, "maybe you need to go. We're in the middle of a celebration, Anne." But before I could finish, he stepped past me, entering the apartment without invitation. "Hey!" Tom called from the living room, his voice sharp. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I quickly slammed the door shut behind him, my hand trembling. "He just walked in," I said, feeling a wave of panic wash over me. "I don't know who he is." The man didn't seem to acknowledge us at all. He simply walked past me, moving with an unsettling calm. He looked around the apartment as if he'd been there before, his gaze slowly sweeping across the room. "What's going on?" Claire whispered from the couch. She was clearly frightened. The man stopped in front of the window, his back still to us. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the hum of the streetlights outside. Then, in a voice that seemed almost too calm for the situation, he spoke again. "You don't need to be afraid," he said, his words too soft, too controlled. "I'm just here to watch." Tom stood up, his face tense. "You need to leave now. This is our place, and you're not welcome here." The man turned slowly to face us, his eyes wide and unblinking. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he looked at us, like he could see right through us, to something far beyond. "You don't understand," he said, his voice barely a whisper now. "You invited me. I've been waiting for years." Before we could react, there was another knock at the door. This time, it was even louder, sharper. I froze, my eyes locked on the man. "What is this?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "What's happening?" I opened the door again, this time with my heart pounding in my chest. But when I looked through the peephole, there was no one there. I opened the door wider, and the hallway was empty. "What the hell?" I muttered. When I turned back to the apartment, the man was gone. We searched the apartment for hours, checking every room, every closet, even the windows. But there was no sign of him. He had vanished completely, as if he had never been there at all. The strange thing was, when I checked the door again, the lock was still in place, as if no one had opened it at all. The faint echo of a laugh seemed to linger in the air, a chilling reminder of the man who had been there, and the mystery that remained. No one has ever explained who he was, or how he found us. But every New Year's Eve since, I can't shake the feeling that he's out there, watching. Story 4. It was New Year's Eve, and I was out with some friends in the city. We'd decided to hit a few bars to ring in the new year, but honestly, I wasn't in the mood for a big celebration. I wasn't much of a drinker, and the crowded bars didn't excite me as much as they used to. Still, I went along with it because my friends were eager to celebrate. The night was going smoothly, laughter, music, and the usual chaos of New Year's Eve. We made our rounds from bar to bar, dancing, chatting, and watching the clock slowly creep toward midnight. By 12:30 a.m., I was exhausted and just wanted to head home. I said my goodbyes to my friends and left the last bar, making my way down the street to the subway. As I walked, I noticed my phone buzz in my pocket. I pulled it out, thinking it was a notification, but when I looked at the screen, I saw a message from an unknown number. Hi. I stared at it for a moment. Who would be texting me at this hour? I didn't recognize the number, but I assumed it might have been a wrong number or someone I had met earlier. Still, something about it felt odd. It was late, and the message seemed almost too simple, too direct. I didn't reply, figuring I'd deal with it later. As I entered the subway station, my phone buzzed again. This time, the message was more insistent, "Answer me." I frowned, confused. Why would someone be so persistent, especially at 1 a.m.? But I decided to text back, asking who it was. "Who is this?" I typed out, my fingers trembling slightly as I pressed send. The subway station was unusually empty, and I felt a strange tension hanging in the air. The reply came almost immediately, "I'm waiting." My heart skipped a beat. The message felt wrong, like it wasn't meant for me. I looked around the empty platform, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. Who would send a text like that? And why? I didn't respond. Instead, I slipped my phone back into my pocket and tried to focus on the trains. I could hear the faint hum of the tracks in the distance, but it only made me feel more isolated. Suddenly, my phone buzzed again. I pulled it out, and my eyes widened in horror. The message was in all caps, "Answer me now." I quickly looked around the platform, but I was alone. I could feel my heart racing as I typed back, my hands shaking with dread. "Who are you? What do you want?" There was a pause before the response came, and when it did, it sent chills down my spine. The message read, "I'll be there soon." My pulse hammered in my ears. I immediately started walking toward the exit, my feet quickening with each step. I didn't know what was happening, but I had this sickening feeling that something wasn't right. Just as I reached the door, I heard a voice. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence of the station like a knife. "Are you running away from me?" I spun around, heart racing, but no one was there. The subway station seemed to stretch out endlessly in front of me, empty and cold. I backed away from the door, trying to make sense of what was happening. Who was this person? And why were they texting me in the first place? I heard a shuffle behind me, the sound of footsteps. I whirled around, but there was no one in sight. A cold chill ran through me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I turned back to the door, about to leave, when my phone buzzed once more. I hesitated, staring at the screen before I opened it. The message read, "I see you." A cold sweat broke out on my neck, and I glanced over my shoulder once again. This time, there was someone standing at the far end of the platform. The figure was shrouded in darkness, their face hidden, but I could feel their gaze locked on me. Without thinking, I bolted for the exit, the sounds of footsteps echoing behind me, growing louder and faster as I ran. I didn't dare turn around. My phone buzzed again. "Why are you running?" the text read. I reached the stairs and took them two at a time, but the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. I couldn't escape it. It was like the person was right behind me, just out of sight. "Why won't you answer?" the text came in, and my hands were shaking as I typed back quickly, "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" The response was chilling. "Because you're mine now." I stumbled onto the street, desperate to get away from the subway station, but when I reached the sidewalk, I saw the figure again. This time, they were much closer, standing at the end of the street, almost like they had been waiting for me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. "Who are you?" I yelled across the street, my voice barely audible. They didn't respond. They just stood there, unmoving. I stepped back, my instincts screaming at me to run. But I couldn't. My legs were frozen. The figure took a slow, deliberate step toward me, and I could feel the tension growing in the air. Another text came through. "I'm right here." I snapped my head back to the screen, and when I looked up again, the figure was even closer. My phone buzzed again. "You won't get away this time." I turned to run, but as I did, I stumbled and fell hard onto the cold pavement. My phone slipped from my hand, and I heard it hit the ground with a sharp crack. I scrambled to pick it up, but when I looked back up, the figure was gone. Confused and terrified, I pulled myself up and glanced around. The street was still empty. No trace of the figure, no sign of anyone following me. I quickly picked up my phone, my heart pounding, and checked it. The screen was cracked, but I could still make out the last message. "Goodbye." A cold shiver ran down my spine as I looked around one last time, only to see nothing. The figure was gone, and everything had fallen silent again. But as I started walking back toward my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I glanced at my phone one more time. And there it was. A message from the same unknown number, sent just after I had stood up from the fall. "See you soon." Story 5. It was New Year's Eve, and I was out with 3 close friends, Lily, John, and Kevin. We'd spent the night hopping between bars, enjoying the celebration, and despite not being much of a drinker, I was having a decent time. As the clock struck midnight, I felt a wave of relief. The night was winding down, and I just wanted to get home. By the time we left the last bar, it was already around 1:30 a.m. The streets were quieter now, with fewer people around, and the city felt like it was in a deep slumber. My apartment was only about 10 minutes away, and since I was the designated driver, I said goodbye to the others and took the long, familiar route home. As I drove, I noticed a car trailing me. I didn't think much of it at first. Sometimes cars follow each other on quiet streets, especially after the chaos of New Year's Eve. But after a few turns, I realized that the car behind me was still there. It hadn't passed me, and it wasn't turning off at any of the intersections. I glanced in my rearview mirror. The car was close, much closer than I was comfortable with. It was a dark sedan, its headlights piercing through the foggy night, but I couldn't make out any details. The driver was too far away to see, but something about the way the car stayed on my tail made me uneasy. "Hey, Lily, do you think this guy is following me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual as I looked over at her. She was sitting in the passenger seat, staring out the window. She turned to me, then glanced behind us. "Yeah, I think so," she said, her voice quiet. "It's been a while now." I increased my speed slightly, hoping the car would back off, but it stayed right behind me, as if it were glued to my bumper. I felt my heart rate pick up. I took a few more turns, trying to lose the car, but every time I did, it followed. It was as if the driver knew exactly where I was going. "I'm freaking out," I muttered, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. "I don't think this is just a coincidence anymore." John, who was sitting in the back seat, let out a nervous laugh. "Maybe it's just someone going in the same direction. Don't overthink it." But his voice lacked conviction. I could tell he was getting nervous too. I took another turn, heading toward my apartment complex. The car behind me stayed just as close, and I could see the reflection of its headlights in the side mirrors. My palms were sweating, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. This wasn't right. "I don't think we should go home," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though I could feel the panic rising. "We should find a public place, somewhere crowded, just in case." Lily looked over at me, her face pale. "Yeah, I don't like this. Why hasn't he turned off yet? He's been following us for ages. Maybe he's lost?" Kevin offered from the back seat, though his voice was unsteady. "Maybe it's just a coincidence." But I could see the doubt in his eyes. We all felt it, the strange, heavy feeling of being stalked. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour gas station, hoping to throw the car off, but the sedan followed me in. It stopped a few spaces away, its headlights still glowing brightly. I sat in the car, trying to catch my breath, and for a few moments, no one spoke. "Should we call the cops?" Lily asked quietly, glancing at me. "I don't like this." "What if he's—" "I don't know if we should do that," I interrupted, my voice low and anxious. "What if it makes things worse? What are we supposed to do, just sit here and wait?" John snapped, his nerves clearly fraying. "What if he—" "Shoo." I hushed him, my voice sharp. I was too terrified to speak calmly. "Listen." We all fell silent. For a long, suffocating moment, we could hear nothing but the hum of the lights above us. Then, a sudden sound made my heart drop, a soft knock on the window. My blood ran cold. The figure was standing right outside, staring in. I could barely make out his face, hidden in shadow, but his eyes were wide open, unsettlingly focused. "Should I roll down the window?" Lily whispered, her voice tight with fear. "What if—" "No!" I whispered fiercely, grabbing her arm. "Don't you dare." John's breathing was ragged now. "He's just standing there. What the hell does he want?" I stared at the man through the windshield, paralyzed with fear. "I don't know. He's just standing there." The man didn't move for what felt like an eternity. His face remained hidden in the shadow of his hood, but I could feel his eyes burning into us. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. I almost dropped it in my panic. "Who's texting you?" Kevin asked, voice shaky. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. I checked the message. "Look in your rearview mirror." My stomach dropped, and I slowly turned my eyes to the rearview mirror. I couldn't see the man anymore, but instead, a new figure had appeared, tall, cloaked in black, and walking toward us with an unnatural calm. I was paralyzed, unable to move or speak. The tension in the car was unbearable. "We need to go. Now." Lily's voice was a whisper, barely audible. She was close to crying. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtering to life. My foot slammed the gas pedal, but as I moved forward, I caught a glimpse of the man in my rearview mirror. He was standing in the middle of the gas station lot, staring after us. "Drive faster." John screamed, his voice filled with panic. I slammed my foot down even harder, the car speeding down the road. The man stayed behind us in the rearview mirror, his figure growing smaller as I picked up speed. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. "What's going on?" Kevin gasped, looking back at the road. "Why won't he stop?" "I don't know. I don't know." I shouted, barely able to breathe. The car followed for what felt like miles, until it finally stopped. I didn't see it in the rearview mirror anymore. For a brief moment, I thought we were safe. But just as I was about to relax, my phone buzzed again. I glanced down at the screen, my heart freezing. The message read, "You can't escape me." I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt in the middle of the empty road. "Who is this?" Lily whispered, her voice shaking. "Who the hell is this person?" "I don't know." I cried, almost hysterical. "I don't know what they want." I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. We were being watched. I didn't know how I knew it, but I could feel it. The presence was there, lingering, waiting. Kevin's phone buzzed next. He looked down at it, his face turning ashen. "Guys," he started slowly. "I just got a text." "From who?" John demanded, his eyes wide with terror. Kevin didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the screen, unable to speak. Finally, he whispered, "It says, you're not safe." Story 6. It was the kind of night where the world felt suspended in time, like everything was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Most people were out celebrating, toasting to a fresh start. But not me. I was working, stuck on the midnight shift at an old, run-down library that had been abandoned for years, except for the night staff who had nowhere else to be. I didn't mind, though. The silence of the place was almost comforting, and the cold winter air outside kept everyone inside. But tonight felt different. The cold that crept in through the cracks of the library didn't just chill my bones, it felt like it was creeping into my very soul. I was alone, except for Emily. She'd swapped shifts with me so she could attend a New Year's Eve party. I didn't mind doing her a favor. She seemed grateful, though a little too eager to get out the door, as if something were weighing on her. She didn't even say goodbye when she left, just gave me a nod and rushed out into the dark. I shrugged it off, but as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. The library was so quiet that every small sound felt amplified, like whispers from another time. At around 11:30 p.m., I was doing my usual rounds when I noticed something strange. The main hall, usually dimly lit, was darker than usual. I stood still, staring into the blackness ahead of me. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was like something was blocking it, like the darkness had substance. Then, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone was walking right behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. Just the echo of the footsteps, now a little louder, more insistent. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Emily?" No answer. The only sound that followed was a faint scraping, like fingernails dragging across wood. I moved toward the sound, each step heavier than the last. The hallway stretched out before me, but it felt like it was growing longer, like the walls were pushing in on me. Finally, I reached the reading room. The door was slightly ajar, a dim light flickering from within. As I pushed it open, I saw her, Emily. She was sitting at one of the tables, her back to me, her head hanging low, as if she were sleeping. But something was wrong. The air around her was unnaturally cold, and her movements were stiff, like she was no longer entirely human. "Emily?" I whispered, my voice cracking. She didn't respond. I stepped closer, but my feet seemed to stick to the floor, as if something was holding me back. When I finally reached her, I touched her shoulder. The second I did, she jolted upright, her eyes wide open, but they weren't Emily's eyes. They were black. Pure black, without a single trace of white. "Don't touch me," she hissed, her voice not her own, deeper, raspier. "It's too late for you." Before I could move, the room began to spin. The walls seemed to collapse in on me, the light flickering violently. I couldn't breathe. My heart raced in my chest, and the air became so thick I thought I was suffocating. I spun around to leave, but the door slammed shut in front of me. I turned back to Emily, but she wasn't there anymore. The chair where she had sat was empty. The room was now pitch dark, and the only sound was the slow scraping again, now louder, coming from every direction. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. A soft laugh echoed through the darkness, a hollow sound, as if it was coming from deep inside the walls themselves. I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place. Then, I heard a voice. A soft, feminine voice, like a lullaby sung just for me. "You shouldn't have stayed," it whispered. "You shouldn't have come back." The room flickered to life again, and there, standing in front of me, was Emily, but she wasn't the Emily I knew. Her skin was pale, stretched tight over her bones, and her lips were twisted into a grin that was far too wide. Her hands were unnaturally long, the fingers extending as if they could reach through the very walls. I don't understand," I stammered, my throat dry, my mind racing. "You'll understand soon enough," she said, her voice distorted, as if coming from several places at once. I took a step back, my feet stumbling over the floor. The shadows in the room seemed to grow deeper, moving closer to me, pressing in from all sides. I felt like the air itself was alive, suffocating me with its weight. "Emily, what's happening? What's going on?" I demanded, my voice breaking. Her grin stretched wider, impossibly wide, as her fingers twitched. "You don't belong here anymore. None of us do." I felt my pulse race, my head spinning. "What do you mean? Please, tell me. I don't understand." She tilted her head, her black eyes glinting as if she were watching something invisible, something far beyond me. Her lips parted, and she whispered in a voice I couldn't comprehend, like a chant or a prayer. "We are the ones who stay. The ones who linger. The ones who never leave." The shadows in the room began to stretch, writhing as if they had a life of their own. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the darkness around me wasn't just the absence of light, it was the presence of something ancient, something far older than the library itself. I scrambled for the door, my hands shaking as I reached for the handle. But when I turned it, the door wouldn't budge. Panic gripped me. "Let me out. Please." I screamed, yanking at the door, but it remained locked. Emily was standing right behind me, her breath cold on my neck. "It's too late," she whispered, her voice distorted again, like it was coming from inside my head. "You can't leave." I turned around, but she was gone. The room was empty, save for the lingering presence of the shadows, now more tangible, more suffocating. I spun back to the door and shoved it with all my strength. It creaked open, but when I stepped outside, I found myself back in the same spot. The library was the same, yet completely different, as if it had somehow shifted, twisted into something else. And there, at the far end of the hall, was Emily, standing perfectly still, her black eyes locked onto me, her smile never faltering. "I told you," she said softly. "You shouldn't have stayed." I stumbled backward, my heart racing, my breath coming in short gasps. The floor beneath me felt unstable, like the very ground was shifting, pulling me down into the darkness. Before I knew it, the door slammed shut again, and the world around me collapsed into nothing. I woke up hours later, slumped against the library's front door, gasping for breath. The night air felt strangely warm against my skin. I stumbled to my feet, my heart still pounding in my chest, and looked around. There was no sign of Emily. I checked the time. It was 3 a.m. How had so much time passed? But that wasn't the strangest thing. The library, once so dark and oppressive, now felt strangely empty. Too empty. When I reached for my phone to call for help, I saw a text message waiting for me. It was from Emily. "Don't come back here. It's not safe anymore." I stared at the message, a chill running down my spine. As I left the library, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. The darkness felt alive, shifting behind me with every step I took. And when I looked back, I swore I saw her, Emily, standing in the doorway, her eyes black, her smile wide, waiting for me to turn around. I never did. The end leaves it unclear whether Emily was still there, or if something far darker had taken her place, and whether the protagonist truly escaped or if they are now part of the darkness that haunts the library. Story 7. It was the kind of night when everything felt just a little off, like the world was teetering on the edge of something dark, something unknown. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows of my truck, and the clock in the dash ticked closer to midnight. Most people were celebrating the new year, surrounded by friends and family, but not me. I was stuck working, alone, clearing a piece of land for a client who'd left me no room to negotiate. I hadn't planned on being out here. I'd gotten a call from Mr. Bennett a few weeks ago, just before Christmas. He'd inherited an overgrown plot of land out in the middle of nowhere, and despite my protests about the timing, he insisted it needed to be done by the new year. "No excuses," he'd said, his voice sharp, almost too eager. I should have known then that something wasn't right. The land was far from civilization, buried deep in a thick forest, with no sign of life for miles around. The drive out had been long, filled with icy roads and the occasional flicker of my headlights catching glimpses of strange, half-buried shapes in the snow. The place was unnerving. When I arrived, the property was just as desolate as I remembered from the photos. A clearing surrounded by thick trees, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. The air was heavy, and the ground was frozen solid. As I parked near the edge of the clearing, I felt that familiar chill down my spine, the kind you get when something's wrong, but you don't know what. "All right, let's get this over with," I muttered to myself, grabbing my tools and stepping out into the night. I wasn't expecting the job to be easy. There was plenty of brush to clear, and some of the trees were far too close together, but I didn't think it would be this strange. The first few hours were uneventful. The cold stung my face, and the occasional sound of cracking wood broke the silence. But as I worked, I started to notice something odd. There were no animal tracks in the snow. No birds, no squirrels, not even the distant howls of wolves. Then, at around 11:45 p.m., I stopped. I had just started clearing a pile of brush when I noticed something off in the distance, a dark shape against the backdrop of trees. It was a patch of land, cleared out of the underbrush, but the cuts on the trees were jagged and uneven, almost as if someone had used an old axe to chop them down. "That's strange," I muttered, walking toward it. As I moved closer, the unease I'd felt all night shifted into something heavier. It wasn't just the odd clearing. The air had changed, becoming denser, almost suffocating. My boots crunched in the snow, but the sound felt muffled, as if the ground was absorbing it. And then, I saw it. A figure. A woman, standing in the center of the clearing, her back to me. She wore an old, tattered coat, the fabric almost blending with the night. I called out to her. She didn't respond. "Hey, are you lost?" I shouted, my voice sounding small in the vast emptiness. No answer. I took a few steps closer, my heartbeat quickening, and called out again. "Hello?" Still nothing. She didn't move an inch, just stood there, staring ahead, like she hadn't heard me. My instincts screamed at me to turn around and run, but something compelled me to step closer. The snow crunched louder underfoot as I approached. "Ma'am?" I asked, my voice trembling a bit. "Are you all right?" The figure slowly turned toward me, and when she did, my blood ran cold. Her eyes were wide open, but they were pitch black, no iris, no white, just deep, endless darkness. And her face, her lips twisted into a smile that wasn't human. "Go away," she rasped, her voice hoarse, like it hadn't been used in years. "Leave this place." I froze, unable to move, as the smile stretched wider, impossibly wide. What are you talking about?" I stammered. "You should have never come here," she said, stepping toward me, her movements jerky and unnatural, like she was fighting to maintain her balance. "This land doesn't belong to you, not anymore." I backed away slowly, my mind racing. I am just here to do my job. I'm leaving now, okay?" She tilted her head, her smile never faltering. "It's too late to leave. The land doesn't let go of those who disturb it." My breath caught in my throat. The temperature had dropped, and the air was growing thicker, colder, as if the world around me was freezing in place. "I need to get back," I whispered, stepping backward, my voice shaky. "I'll go now." But she didn't move. Instead, her gaze locked onto mine, and for a moment, I saw something else in her eyes, something dark, something ancient, like a void swallowing everything around it. And then, without warning, the ground beneath me shifted. I stumbled, almost falling as the earth seemed to tremble. The trees around me creaked and groaned, their branches swaying violently as if they were alive. The woman didn't say another word. She just stood there, watching me, as the forest seemed to come alive with an eerie whispering sound, like voices calling from deep within the trees. "Get out!" I screamed, finally turning to run, my heart racing. "Leave me alone." The snow beneath my feet seemed to slow me down, the ground softening and pulling me in. I could feel the earth shifting, pulling at me, and when I looked over my shoulder, I saw her, no longer standing still, but moving toward me, her figure twisting unnaturally, like she was being dragged by something unseen. I reached the truck, gasping for air, and jumped into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life with a sputter, and I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding away from the clearing. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, my hands trembling on the wheel, my pulse still hammering in my ears. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw something that froze me. The woman, standing at the edge of the forest, watching me. Her black eyes reflected the dim headlights of my truck as if they were watching me through the rearview, following me. And just before I turned the corner, I swear I heard her whisper one last thing. "You'll never leave." Story 8. It was supposed to be a quiet New Year's Eve. After all, I had no big plans. Most of my friends were out at parties, celebrating the arrival of the new year, but I was stuck working at the old university library. I had taken the night shift to make some extra money, just me and the dim lights of the reading room, surrounded by shelves of ancient, dusty books. The building itself was ancient, towering over the city like a forgotten monument to some bygone era. Ridley Hall was the kind of place that seemed more alive at night. The high ceilings, creaky wooden floors, and the echoing silence made it feel like the walls were watching you, waiting for you to notice them. I had been here for hours, sipping cold coffee and flicking through a few maintenance reports when I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, as if someone was pacing up and down the hallway outside my office. I stood up, alarmed. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing off the walls. No response. I hesitated, then walked out into the hallway. The lights flickered overhead as I made my way toward the source of the sound. It was coming from the basement. "Who's there?" I called again, my heart racing. There was no answer, only the soft creak of footsteps that continued to move deeper into the darkness below. Reluctantly, I made my way down the narrow staircase, my steps creaking with each descent. The air grew colder as I reached the bottom, and the musty smell of old papers and mildew seemed to cling to the walls. The basement was an eerie place, long rows of filing cabinets, old furniture covered in dust, and boxes stacked haphazardly against the walls. It was a storage area, never used unless absolutely necessary. As I reached the last step, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A figure, standing in the far corner of the room. It was a man, no, a shape, shrouded in a dark, tattered coat, his face hidden in shadow. He was standing unnaturally still, as if waiting for me to come closer. My legs felt heavy as I moved forward, my breath catching in my throat. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though it trembled slightly. The figure didn't respond. I took a few more steps. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," I said more firmly, my voice echoing through the room. Still, no response. Then, as if in slow motion, the figure turned towards me. His face was hollow, his eyes empty voids. His lips barely moved, but I heard him speak, his voice a low rasp that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the shadows. "Get out," he whispered. I froze. The words seemed to hang in the air, vibrating with an unnatural force. I wanted to turn and run, but my body refused to obey. My feet were cemented to the floor, my pulse pounding in my ears. Suddenly, the figure began to move, but not like a normal person. It was as if his limbs were stretching and contorting, bending in ways that defied the laws of nature. His arms grew longer, his fingers reaching out towards me like tendrils of darkness. "Leave, now," he croaked, his voice growing louder, more forceful. I tried to step back, but my feet still wouldn't move. The temperature in the room plummeted, my breath now visible in the freezing air. The shadows around me seemed to twist and stretch, swirling like a storm, closing in around me. I could feel the pressure in the room, like the very air was pressing down on me, suffocating me. It was as if the darkness itself wanted to consume me. With every ounce of strength I had left, I finally managed to break free, stumbling backward towards the stairs. But as I turned to run, I heard something that stopped me cold. A laugh. It was dry, wheezing, and far too close. It echoed off the walls, sending a chill racing up my spine. I whipped around, but there was nothing there, just the empty, cold basement. "Who? What are you?" I whispered, my voice shaking uncontrollably. I didn't get an answer. Instead, I felt something brush against my shoulder, something cold and wet, like a hand made of ice. I bolted up the stairs, not daring to look back. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I could feel the cold sweat on my skin as I raced through the empty halls. The library seemed different now, too quiet, too still. When I finally made it to the door, I couldn't get it open. The handle turned, but the door wouldn't budge. I pressed my shoulder against it, desperate to escape, but it was as if the building itself was refusing to let me go. "Come on!" I shouted, my voice cracking. I slammed my body into the door again and again, but nothing happened. The air around me grew colder, and I felt a presence looming over me. And then, just as I was about to give up, the door swung open by itself. I didn't look back as I ran out into the freezing night air, gasping for breath. The wind stung my skin, but it didn't matter. I had to get away from that place. The next morning, I called the security office, reporting what had happened. They were skeptical, of course, dismissing it as just another night of stress. But when I returned to work the following week, something strange happened. I went down to the basement again, curious, but hesitant. The moment I stepped onto the lower floor, I felt the temperature drop. The lights flickered above me as I made my way down the hallway. But when I reached the room where the figure had stood, it was empty. Or so I thought. I walked to the far corner, where I had seen him. There, on the dusty floor, was a single piece of paper, a note, written in a shaky, erratic hand. "Leave before it's too late." I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every year on New Year's Eve, I feel that same icy presence lurking, waiting for me to return. And sometimes, just sometimes, when I walk past Ridley Hall, I swear I see him again, the figure in the shadows, watching from the basement window, his black eyes staring straight through me. And I know deep down, that one day, I might not be able to escape again. Story 9. It was a cold New Year's Eve, the kind of night when the world feels frozen, like time itself is standing still, waiting for something to break the silence. The streets were empty, save for the occasional car speeding by, and the air was thick with the kind of frost that made your breath hang in the air like smoke. I had no plans. The party invitations had been few and far between this year, and after a long, exhausting workday, I was ready to spend the evening alone. My twin sister, Clara, was different. She was always the life of the party, the one who filled the room with laughter and light. She loved New Year's Eve more than anyone I knew, and it was no surprise when she dragged me out of my room that evening. "Riley, we're going out," she said, bursting into my room with that mischievous grin I knew all too well. "It's New Year's Eve. You can't spend it alone again." I groaned. "Clara, I really don't feel like it. I'd rather stay in." But she wouldn't have it. "Come on. You need a little fun. We're going to a new place. I've been dreaming about it, and it's perfect." Her excitement was infectious, and despite my reluctance, I agreed to go. After all, she wouldn't take no for an answer. We didn't need much explanation, Clara never did. She had a way of pulling you into whatever scheme she was hatching, no matter how strange it seemed. We drove through the darkened streets, the city lights fading as we left the more populated areas behind. The road grew narrower, winding through forests and fields. There was a chill in the air that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "This place is perfect," Clara said as we turned down a small, barely visible dirt road. "I've seen it in my dreams." "Clara, this is crazy," I muttered, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. The moonlight cast eerie shadows over the trees, and the air felt wrong, thick and suffocating. "We're almost there," she reassured me, her grip on the steering wheel tightening. When we reached the end of the road, we saw it, a large, decrepit mansion, surrounded by a rusted iron gate. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years, with vines crawling up the sides and windows shattered like broken teeth. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "This place doesn't look safe." Clara didn't answer. She was already out of the car, practically skipping toward the front door, which creaked open as if it had been expecting us. Inside, the air was heavy, the walls lined with dust and cobwebs. The floors creaked beneath our feet as we moved further into the mansion, and the faint smell of mildew filled the air. The rooms were eerily quiet, save for the occasional gust of wind that made the house groan. Clara was practically glowing, her eyes wide with excitement. "Isn't it beautiful? I've been here before, in my dreams." I wasn't so sure. Something about this place felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be here. But before I could voice my concerns, Clara led me into what seemed to be a ballroom. The massive chandelier above was covered in dust, and the floor was strewn with old furniture, but in the center of the room was a long, grand dining table. It was set with plates, wine glasses, and a bottle of champagne in the center. "Clara, this is all too much," I said, trying to take in the bizarre sight. "Who set all this up?" But she wasn't listening. She was already pouring the champagne, her face lit with a feverish excitement. "We need to celebrate. We're here, it's New Year's Eve, and we're going to have a toast." I hesitated. "Clara, something's off. Let's just leave." But Clara's gaze was fixed on the table, a faraway look in her eyes. "You don't understand. This is what I've been waiting for." Before I could say anything else, she raised her glass and turned toward me. "To new beginnings," she whispered, her voice strangely hollow. "To the future." I felt a chill run through me as I reluctantly lifted my own glass. "To the future," I echoed, my voice faltering. But as soon as the words left my lips, the air in the room seemed to change. The temperature dropped sharply, and I could feel my breath turning to ice in my lungs. Clara smiled, but it wasn't her usual joyful grin. It was wide, almost unnatural. "Riley, do you hear it?" she asked, her voice laced with something dark. "The music?" I strained my ears, but all I could hear was the soft rustling of the wind outside. "There's no music," I replied, my voice tight with unease. "Clara, I think we need to go." But then I heard it, a faint, haunting melody, coming from somewhere deep within the mansion. It was as if the music was coming from the walls themselves. It was distant at first, but it grew louder with every passing second, filling the room with its eerie, mournful tune. Clara's eyes lit up. "It's time," she said softly. "It's finally time." Before I could respond, the chandelier above us began to sway, its crystals tinkling like distant bells. The walls seemed to close in around us, and the air grew thick with an oppressive weight. I tried to move, to run, but my body refused to obey. It felt like something was pulling me, holding me in place. "Clara, what's happening?" I cried out, my voice barely audible over the rising crescendo of the music. "What's going on?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped back from the table, her eyes glazed over, as if she was no longer there with me. The smile on her face stretched wider, impossibly wide, as she began to sway in time with the haunting music. "Clara, please," I whispered, panic rising in my chest. "Come back to me. This isn't real." But she only whispered, her voice distant. "You were never supposed to leave, Riley. This was always meant to happen." The lights flickered above us, and the music reached a deafening pitch. The room seemed to spin, and I felt my legs give way beneath me. I collapsed to the floor, my vision blurring as I reached for Clara. And then, in the blink of an eye, everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, Clara was gone. The room was empty, save for the table still set with glasses and plates, the champagne now spilled across the floor. The mansion was silent again, and the walls seemed to breathe with an unsettling presence. I stumbled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. "Clara?" I called, my voice trembling. But there was no answer. I turned to leave, but the door that had once been wide open was now sealed shut. I was trapped. From the shadows, I heard a soft laugh, Clara's laugh, but it wasn't quite her own. It was hollow, echoing in the emptiness of the room. And then, just before midnight, I saw her. Clara stood at the doorway, her face twisted into that same unnerving smile. Her eyes were black, voids of darkness that seemed to swallow the light. And in her hand, she held a glass of champagne. "Riley," she whispered, her voice distant and hollow. "It's too late to leave now. You're part of this now." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The music began again, filling the air with its eerie melody. And as the clock struck midnight, I realized the truth. Some places never let go of their guests. And some people, like Clara, are never truly gone. Story 10. The night air was colder than I had expected, cutting through my jacket like a sharp knife. It was New Year's Eve, a night when most people were out with friends, toasting to the new year. But not me. I was stuck working at the car dealership, doing a shift that I'd been dreading all week. Lot 9, the supervisor had said over the phone earlier. "Make sure everything's in order. We're closing early tonight." It wasn't the kind of work I usually did. Normally, I handled inventory and paperwork, but tonight, I was told to take a walk through the back lot to check on the older vehicles, ones that had been there for years, collecting rust and dust. They were leftovers from trade-ins and accidents, abandoned and forgotten in the far corner of the dealership's property. I grabbed the flashlight and started walking towards the back lot. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, making everything seem darker, quieter. The lot was empty, save for the occasional flicker of my flashlight against the rusted frames of old cars. There was one in particular that caught my eye. It was an old sedan, its paint a faded gray, the tires flat and the windows cracked. I'd seen it before, but I couldn't remember exactly when or where. It had been sitting here for months, if not longer. I took a few steps closer and noticed something strange. The car was positioned differently from the last time I had checked. It wasn't facing the same direction, and it seemed closer to the entrance of the lot than it had been before. "Must be a mistake," I muttered, shaking my head. "Maybe someone moved it for repairs." I pulled out my phone to check the time. 11:57 p.m. The clock on the dash flashed as I glanced at it. The dealership was almost empty now, with only a few staff members finishing up their shifts. Everyone else was either out celebrating or at home. Just then, I heard a faint noise, a scraping sound, like metal dragging against concrete. It came from the direction of the car. I froze. The sound grew louder, echoing through the lot like it was moving closer. I turned my flashlight toward the car, but there was no one there. Just the empty space, the wrecked vehicle, and the cold night air. "Probably just a cat or something," I muttered to myself, trying to ignore the chill creeping up my spine. But the sound continued. And then, I saw it. The car door, slowly creaking open. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run, but I was rooted to the spot. I stepped closer, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice shaking slightly. No response. I hesitated for a moment longer, then walked toward the car. As I got closer, I saw something inside the vehicle, shadows. Figures, moving slightly, just enough to make out a faint silhouette. My breath caught in my throat. "Hello?" I said again, louder this time. And then, the door slammed shut. I jumped back, startled. My heart was racing, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't want to go near the car anymore. Something wasn't right. I turned to leave, but then, I heard a voice. A low, rasping whisper, almost drowned by the wind. "You shouldn't have come here." I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The car was empty now. The door was closed. There was nothing there. I blinked, trying to shake off the fear clawing at me. What the hell is going on? I whispered to myself. "Are you alright, Sam?" I turned to find my coworker, Thomas, standing a few feet away. He had come to check on me, his face etched with confusion. "I heard someone screaming," Thomas said. "What's going on?" I looked back at the car, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move inside. But it was gone, just like that. "I don't know," I muttered. "Something's off about this place." The car. I swear I heard it move. Thomas stared at me, eyes wide. "Sam, there's no one here. You must be tired. It's been a long day." "I'm not tired," I snapped. There was something in that car. It moved. Thomas shook his head. "Listen, you're probably hearing things. Let's get you back inside. The shift is almost over, and I'll walk you to your car." I hesitated, but eventually nodded. As we walked toward the dealership, the air felt heavier, as if the darkness of the back lot had followed me, wrapping around my body like a second skin. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened out there, something I wasn't meant to understand. The wind picked up, and the sound of rustling leaves filled the air. Just as we reached the front entrance, I heard it again, the scraping sound. Louder this time, coming from lot 9. I turned to Thomas, but he was already heading back inside, oblivious to the noise. I stood still for a moment, looking back over my shoulder. The light from the dealership illuminated the lot behind me, but it didn't reach the farthest corner, where the old car sat. And then, just as I was about to head inside, I saw something. The car's headlights flickered on. The engine roared to life, and it started to move, slowly at first, like a creature waking from a long slumber. I ran back toward the door, but before I could reach it, the car shot forward, the tires screeching across the asphalt. I turned to look, but the lot was empty. The next morning, the car was gone. The lot was clean, as if nothing had ever happened. I asked the others if they'd seen anything, but they all looked at me like I was crazy. And then, a few weeks later, when I checked the dealership's records, I found something odd. There was no record of that car. It wasn't listed as one of the trade-ins. No insurance papers. It had never existed. But I knew what I saw. And every New Year's Eve, when I pass by that lot, I can't help but wonder if it's still out there. Waiting.